Craft is a 2.5-year-old foreign policy think tank based here in Washington, D.C., that advocates a grand strategy of restraint for the United States. We aim to move U.S. foreign policy away from endless war and towards vigorous diplomacy, economic engagement, and the combating of existential threats such as climate change. Our vision is a world where peace is the norm and war is the exception. We are here today to engage in a conversation on the topic South Asia and the Global South in a world of sharpening great power rivalries. Now, South Asia makes up a fifth of humanity. It contains 3 of the world's 10 largest countries by population, India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh. And of course, it's also a vital part of Asia and a core component of the Global South. In recent years, the so-called great power competition between the United States, Russia, and China has drawn some very different responses in the region. While India and the United States both see China as a rival, Pakistan is a de facto ally of Beijing that is recently trying to diversify its partnerships. And smaller South Asian states, such as Bangladesh and Sri Lanka, are caught somewhere in between. On Russia, however, South Asia takes a much more benign view, as indicated by the recent reactions and the votes in the United Nations on the Ukraine conflict. The Biden administration's view of an existential threat or existential struggle between democracies and autocracies finds few takers in the region. To add to all this, South Asia must also play its part in increasing transnational threats, such as climate change, in which the United States has an abiding interest in solving. So as the great power competition intensifies, where does South Asia stand? Where does it stand with respect to the Global South? And how will its choices impact the Global South's relations with the United States? So to discuss these questions, and indeed many more, we have a very distinguished guest today joining us. Former Indian National Security Advisor and Foreign Secretary, Shivshankar Menon. Welcome to the Quincy Institute, Shivshankar Menon.
Thank you for asking me. It's good of you.
You have a very extensive bio, so I'm going to keep it short, because if I read it all, we will take up maybe the whole hour. So you are currently visiting professor at Ashoka University, India, and chair of the Ashoka Center for China Studies. You're also chairman of the advisory board at the Institute of Chinese Studies, New Delhi, distinguished visiting research fellow at the National University of Singapore, a member of the board of trustees at the International Crisis Group, and a distinguished fellow at Asia Society Policy Institute in New York. From 2010 to 2014, you were India's National Security Advisor. Prior to that, you were India's Foreign Secretary between 2006 and 2009. Earlier, you served as Indian Ambassador to China, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, and Israel. You have been a Fisher Family Fellow at the Kennedy School, Harvard University, at Richard Wilhelm Fellow at MIT in 2015. You were chosen as one of the top 100 global thinkers by Foreign Policy magazine in 2010. In addition to all this, you also written 2 books. The first one was Choices, Inside the Making of Indian Foreign Policy. I believe that was in 2016. And the second one, that's recent, released only last year, is India and Asian Geopolitics, Past and Present. And indeed, we're going to draw from some of your writings in our conversation today. So wonderful to have you here at the Quincy Institute.
Pleasure to be here.
I want to sort of start by talking about your recent Foreign Affairs article, which was has, I think, evinced a lot of interest, certainly here at the Quincy Institute. And it's titled The Fantasy of the Free World. And in this article, I'm going to quote something that you say about the Ukraine war from your article. You say that the Ukraine war will neither reshape the global order nor presage an ideological showdown of democracies against China and Russia. Far from consolidating the free world, quote unquote, the war has underscored its fundamental incoherence. Russia's invasion does not draw a line in the sand between the allies of the free world and its foes. A global Manichaean struggle is not in the offing. Now, we see evidence of that, don't we? Because if you look at the sort of nations or states outside the NATO bloc and a couple of US allies in Asia, you see that, and this is largely the global south, although not exclusively, you see that the responses have been either lukewarm, ambivalent, or even neutral, in some cases with even some understanding of the Russian position. There's been, of course, the votes at the UN, but there's also been a great reluctance to impose sanctions on Russia. About 75% of the world's population, countries that represent that population, have not levied any sanctions on Russia. So that gets to two questions drawing from your essay as to why the global south resists this sort of framing that the US has provided and its allies of democracies versus autocracies with respect to this conflict, but also beyond. And secondly, why do you think Washington persists with this sort of blinkered perception of this grand global struggle?
That's actually a really good question. I think you're absolutely right. If you look at the countries who have actually implemented sanctions happily or imposed sanctions of their own on Russia after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, it doesn't include countries like Mexico, like Brazil, South Africa. These are democracies. And countries which are close to the US. I mean, on most issues, India, so I think you're right. Part of the reluctance is, I think, in the global south at least, is a fear that we're going back to a bipolar framing of the world and back to the Cold War days, which were not necessarily the best days for most of the countries in the global south, when in fact, the killing fields of the Cold War were really in the south, where the south were really felt like pawns and didn't have very much control of their own fates. It's really in the unipolar moment, the globalization decades, that many of these countries like India and so on, actually came into their own and were great beneficiaries of the kind of growth that globalization brought to us. So I think there's an instinctive sort of worry about being pushed back into a bipolar framing. But the other thing is, frankly, and I mean, this would be my response, the balance of power is completely different from what it was during the Cold War, when it was free world versus autocracies. And in Asia, at least, where we sit when we look at the world, I mean, Russia is not a military presence or an economic presence in the Indo-Pacific. So, I mean, frankly, that framing doesn't apply to what we are seeing here. Here, the big issues are coping with the rise of China. I mean, all these hotspots that we see in Asia, whether it's Senkakus, whether it's Taiwan, South China Sea, the India-China border, these are all related to China's rise in a sense. And this sort of free world autocracies actually, in fact, sort of pushes Russia into Chinese arms and consolidates an autocrat's bloc when, in fact, the basis for it doesn't exist. Today, China is much more dependent on and linked to the rest of the world than the Soviet Union ever was. And if the aim is to decouple China and to force them into some kind of new bloc and to offer an alternate order of their own, as we had between the so-called socialist world and the free world, I mean, that frankly is not the way we think the world should be going. We'd like a much more open, plural world where there's room for all of us to have a say, a rule-based order which works for us rather than, and enables us to concentrate on the important things, our own transformation, our own economic development, and rather than to go back to, now, why does the US persist? I can't answer for the US, but I sometimes get the feeling that Russia is the adversary that the US is comfortable with. There's a long history to this. It's rather like, Pakistan is the adversary India is comfortable with. But the real issues, to our mind at least today, are about China. And that's a country that nobody is very comfortable with or certain about how to deal with. I mean, you get multiple answers to that question. I think it's a legitimate question. What is India's China strategy? What is the US China strategy? What is the Biden administration's China strategy? So I think there's some of that also. There are old habits of thought, which I think, but I can't answer for why the US persists with this framing. I don't think it's very productive.
Yeah, certainly. Some of the questions you just mentioned, we are going to get to in a few minutes. But I found it interesting that what you just said, I think, has a lot of salience, but also was rooted in the understanding of India or Asia or the global South from a standpoint of interest, that they live in a certain neighborhood, certain presences or absences of powers, proximity, as well as economic development, indeed, that they want to do well. There is here in Washington an explanation for the global South that I see cropping up, which is that the global South is calculating its interest, that it's focused on its interests, and there's a shrug there somewhere, and that's how it is. The unspoken subtext to that is that the global South, or Asia indeed, doesn't respond to values-based argument, whereas nations should respond to values. In fact, this democracy versus autocracy framing is all about values. So how do you respond to this sort of unspoken, often, but somewhat cynical interpretation of the global South?
It seems to me that the South has actually learned from the North. I think, and this is a problem that is maybe common to all democracies, that we present policy based on interests in terms of values in order to convince our own people that we're doing the right thing, the noble thing, the good thing. And we find that necessary as part of our own. But I don't think we necessarily drink our Kool-Aid. And when you look at how states have behaved, whether North or South, I think ultimately it is interests which seem to matter. And I think the South has really learned the lessons of the last 2 centuries of history, as it were. So I am not so sure that it's a valid sort of contrast between values and interests. I think states follow their interests as they see it. And, in the Indian case, for instance, here on Ukraine and this, to me, it's quite clear. Indian interests, the US, the West, is an essential partner for India, right? To transform India, for India's prosperity, security, for what we're trying to do in India. The US, the West are essential partners. Russia may be a desirable partner in certain respects on the Eurasian landmass, where the West is absent in most respects. But desirable is not the same as essential. And you would have seen an evolution. I mean, right from the beginning, the Indian position was to stress the territorial integrity and the sovereignty of Ukraine. I think we've made it quite clear that we don't think much of the invasion and that war is no solution, that it's not going to solve the problems here. But at the same time, I think that we need to find off-ramps rather than seeing this going on, dragging on forever. So, and I think in that sense, we are pursuing our interests. And I think that's common to most countries, I think, in the global South.
Yeah, indeed. I mean, this age-old debate between whether interests matter or values, and indeed sometimes the argument is made that interests, values are interests, and so forth. Uh, Somewhere, I think it doesn't quite make it. When you see the core actions under times of stress, under times of when there are hard choices to be made, interests do seem to trump everything else.
In post-colonial societies, it's a very difficult argument to make about values. I mean, once you start finger pointing, you can point fingers at everybody for having betrayed their own stated values. And so I think it's best actually to, and frankly, why not operate on the basis of interest? Because at least people become predictable. I mean, if you assume that you trust people to pursue their own interest, I think is a much safer way to proceed.
Absolutely. And in interest can also can somewhere derive or values may emerge from that unintentionally, in the sense that we all have an interest in saving the planet. And then, of course, individual nations have their own interests in terms of what they want to do for that. But nevertheless, the overriding threat should or might or hopefully will impel countries to actually work in the common direction. So that's one example. But I want to now bring the conversation to Asia, where again you make some very interesting points in your foreign affairs article, and I'm going to do another quote here because I can't quite say it in my own words in the same way. Uh, you argue that Europe is a sideshow uh, to the main theater of geopolitical drama, Asia. The future of global order will be decided not by wars in Europe, but by the contest for Asia, on which events in Ukraine have limited bearing. Most commentary in Asian capitals has regarded the conflict as a war between Europeans and over the European security order, not an epochal global conflagration. So you make a very sharp point here, almost decentering Europe in the global picture, certainly in the Asian picture. But then you also say that there are impacts of the war on Asia. So tell us what are the impacts, up to what level, and what it does for the Asian order.
Well, I think, for me, the primary issue in the global order, and in fact, the way I see it, we are today between orders globally. We've moved from a unipolar moment after the end of the Cold War into a much more confused situation. I think the primary issue today is, I think, the changing balance of power in Asia, because this is where the center of economic gravity of the world has shifted. This is also where the center of geopolitics is, where the geopolitical disputes, hotspots are all live. And I think ultimately what happens between the US and China is going to be crucial. China's trajectory will matter. Most of the things that will determine our collective future on the big issues, look at the transnational issues, look at climate change, for instance, look at cyber, look at, what do we do with these common domains, which are now so important to all of us. On these issues, I think this is not going to be determined by who wins or loses in Ukraine. In fact, if you do a mental experiment, assume both extremes, Russia is completely defeated, destroyed as a result of the Ukraine war, or the other way around. What changes in the world order, in the world balance of power, on the big issues that affect mankind's future? That doesn't mean that the Ukraine war doesn't have second order effects. It has huge effects on fertilizer, energy markets, on which for Asian countries, Japan, China, India, Korea, crucial. Makes a huge difference to the world economy, fertilizers, you name it. It also has other unforeseen effects. After all, Ukraine was promised when she gave up her nuclear weapons in 1994 in the Budapest Memorandum by the other nuclear weapon states. I mean, 3 signed on immediately, others signed later. They were promised that their territorial integrity and sovereignty would be respected by those who signed. It's not surprising that as soon as well, President Putin mentioned the possible use of nuclear weapons or hinted at it, and invaded Ukraine. You had former Prime Minister Abe speaking of Japan and nuclear weapons. Of course, Kishida immediately said no, no, but other people in the LDP, important people, are saying we need a discussion about this. You know, I think it raises non-proliferation issues both in West Asia and in Northeast Asia. When you've seen what happened to Gaddafi, what happened to Saddam, what happened to Ukraine now, I don't see Kim Jong-un giving up his weapons in this situation. So it has other ramifications which are pretty substantial. We are already, from the global South point of view, we have already been in a debt crisis before this trifecta of war in Ukraine, pandemic, hit us. We were already in an economic slowdown, most of us. And now the combined effect of all three things has created a huge debt crisis. The IMF, World Bank say that something like 35 developing countries are on the brink of default. 9 or 10 of them are already in talks with them for adjustment programs. I mean, we see it in our neighborhood, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, huge debt crisis. So, and yet the world has done nothing. I mean, the world order, if you look at the response of the world order to the pandemic, to this debt crisis, which is not new. I mean, and we know who is owed the money and who could write it off and reschedule. But the response has been really slow. There is no international order actually dealing with it. So from that point of view, frankly, Ukraine therefore becomes a sideshow to what should be our real concerns today and what will determine our futures when you look at it from the point of view of the global South. It has huge effects in Europe, obviously. I mean, German rearmament, the consolidation of the transatlantic alliance, the rebuilding or the building of a new European security order. But in the longer term, frankly, it is very destabilizing in Europe. Even at the rate things are going now, there is going to be a disgruntled but powerful Russia at the heart of Europe if Sweden and Finland now are about to join NATO. So that order itself is going through its own churn. And it's not very easy to see where it's going to settle. How that will, but I don't see that changing the global balance or on the other issues that I mentioned. Sadly, I think it complicates all our lives. It makes so my point was that it doesn't change the Asian balance of power. It's not going to change the global order, but it has huge effects across the board because of the way countries have responded, reacted. Unfortunately, it's also, the way it's being seen is also it's embedded some of these earlier ideas of how different the North is from the South, that refugees from the North are treated differently in Europe than refugees from the South. And, this feeds into all kinds of populist and other political narratives in the South, which is going to complicate our lives even further, I think. So the political ramifications are going to take some time to play themselves out.
Yeah, indeed. And one of the senior Africa analysts that I heard just a few days back did make a point. She said that the fact that so many African countries have been lukewarm, including countries like Morocco, who are allies of the United States or partners, is at least partly down to the fact of the way African students and residents in Ukraine were treated at the border or as they were trying to escape. So these things do resonate. I wanted to sort of just have two critiques of your point, perhaps, and you can speak to them. One is that no doubt the Asian balance of power is dominated by these big capacity differentials, China versus, say, India or Japan and so forth, the US being a presence, a major presence there as well. But then you are talking of two aspects of this war, aren't you? One is the possibility of, as you just mentioned, things like food prices. And we know that food prices and the like triggered the so-called Arab Spring in the Middle East. So there are many vulnerable countries in the region that the US has an abiding interest in, including India and Pakistan and others, where these things potentially could happen, perhaps. The other issue is that, and those would be first order, my point being. And the other issue is the fact that there is the zeal of democracies versus autocracies that you're seeing today in Washington can have its own motive force in a way that translates into secondary sanctions that become very heavy, that may cause substantial decoupling with Asia, although it's not in the United States' interest, indeed, to have that decoupling in a radical sort. There's certainly an argument for certain measures, but not of the extreme sort. So, don't you see a risk of a first order effect through these pathways?
It's possible. I mean, it really is. I'm not denying that it's possible. But as of now, and I think it's almost certain that the threat of secondary sanctions means that most countries, while they might feel some disquiet, will implement sanctions in practice, or at least go along with it. They may not, impose sanctions of their own, but they will, in practice, try and work their way around them without actually flouting them. Certainly, countries like China will draw the conclusion that they need to decouple much quicker and much more effectively, or at least create alternate systems. Somebody told me today that China had met with banks abroad to see what she could do to protect her reserves abroad in case there was action like the actions that have faced the Russian banks. So I can see that happening, but for the rest, whether the food crisis, that's been there even before. Ukraine has made it worse. But the head of FAO has been warning about a world food crisis for the last 3 years, pandemic especially, and then Ukraine have made it worse. And the absence of fertilizer supplies, energy, same problem. Energy prices have gone through the roof. The real problem, though, is the structural problems that exist for many developing countries. Their main sources of income, commodity prices, are very volatile as a result of this trifecta. Tourism, dead. It just isn't there. Pandemic knocked that out. And with Ukraine and so on, it's not coming back. And and remittances, with, a stop on migration. In fact, most of the places where foreign workers from South Asia have been working in the Gulf, many of them had to return home. So for a country like Sri Lanka, therefore, the debt crisis is now a structural crisis. It's not just a question of rescheduling the debt, but how do you then keep the economy going? You need to find new sources of growth, of income. And I think that's a problem so you have a fundamental rebalancing which needs to be done in the global South economically. And this concentration on autocracy versus democracy, I think distracts from that. Maybe they'll use that framing to try and see what they can get out of the system, but it's not a satisfactory way of, I think, addressing such fundamental and core issues. But I'm not denying that, yes, it could have first order. In fact, it is having very serious effects on these societies.
Right. Then I want to spend a little time on South Asia now, and kind of link it to the previous points you made and we talked about, which is about secondary sanctions. These secondary sanctions and other kinds of pressure are indeed building up on South Asian countries to decouple from Russia. Now, India has the most dense relations with Russia of the South Asian states in terms of course, the well-known defense interlinkages. It's not just one-way dependence, it's co-production, export, and things of that sort. There's also the element of energy ties that have been growing of late. And Pakistan, interestingly, has warmed up to Russia. Now, that's not been historically a very warm relationship, but Pakistan, I think, is looking at the future and seeing possibilities and potentials of diversification. And also, of course, the Afghanistan factor is ever present in the Pakistani mind. So we have India and Pakistan don't agree on much, but on Russia, they agree, it appears. So fascinating. The question is, how far can this US pressure on India or preference towards India on decoupling from Russia go? Is it in the Indian interest? Is it indeed in the US interest in an enlightened sense? It certainly is in the short term. And please bring in also Pakistan and Bangladesh if you can, to the extent that you know about them, and I know you know a great deal.
Well, it seems to me that India has been over time trying to reduce her dependence on the Russian economy for defense supplies. I mean, in 2002, something like over 80% of India's defense imports came from Russia. By 2019, this was down, by 2020, actually, this was down to around 35%. The other 65% came from the US, Israel, France. So it's not so much an immediate dependence on imports. It's more existing platforms, the stock of existing platforms, and the nature of what Russia is willing to do, which nobody else has been willing to do in the past. I would hope that conversations between India and the US will see how we can expand what India and the US do. As I said, the US is an essential partner, and the US, and we'll see how that plays out. But that is something that's been going on for years, this sort of diversification, and will happen in India's interest. Sometimes I think public pressure in these cases is not a very good idea, because it generates counter pressures, and then it arouses nationalist feelings, saying, why should we give in to this, and so on. On energy, frankly, I mean, what we do with Russia is minuscule compared to what the Europeans do. I mean, we actually imported less energy from Russia than the US did just before the war. So I don't think that's really a big. Our problem really is to see Russia's role on the Eurasian continent. And there is no substitute for that. There is no Western substitute for that. I don't see a nationalist Russian regime, whether under Putin or whoever, being comfortable playing second fiddle to China. They might be pushed into that position, depending on how things evolve in the Ukraine and so on. But I don't see that as being in the Russian psyche or interest, and certainly not in our interest. And I don't think it's in the West's interest either, actually, in the long run. We'll have to see how this plays out. There are countries here who matter on the continent, Iran, Russia, who we will have to deal with. And it's a reality of our life. India is both a continental and a maritime power. We have continental security issues. The maritime security issues, the Indo-Pacific, the Quad, our relationship with the US, this really works. But the West is absent on the continent now, especially after the withdrawal from Afghanistan. So we work with what we find. And so, which is why I say India and the US have congruence. And that congruence has been growing steadily. But the framing is important, because it depends on which bits you think are important and not important. I think the maritime space is really the future. I mean, that's where our lifelines are, whether it's energy, trade, etc. What about Pakistan and Bangladesh? Bangladesh, for instance, I mean, even our trade relationship with Russia, $8 billion, this is not some huge amount. It's not a great economic dependency. Pakistan and Bangladesh, much less. Russia is not a very major economic or military presence in either the subcontinent or in the Asia-Pacific, in the Indo-Pacific, Asia-Pacific, whichever way you want to define it. In Central Asia, yes, in her near abroad, and in West Asia, in the so-called Middle East, yes, she is active, and increasingly in Africa over the last decade or so, they have chosen to play a military role, which traditionally was played by Britain, by France, and others. So to that extent, I think we need to work with the reality of these interests. But I don't see Russia is the key factor here. I think the key factor is going to be the West's interest and ability to sustain these relationships and to actually invest in them and to address local needs. That's going to be the question.
I want to pick on your point on the US-India relationship. Now, it's a long relationship, a close one. It's grown stronger and stronger. And indeed, for the United States, India is a very important partner, as it should be. On the other hand, there is a trend in recent years of the relationship becoming much more focused on the military to military aspects of the relationship. Now, both the United States and India are large countries, full spectrum presence in so many issues, economics, the environment, trade, norms, all of it. Yet what we are seeing in the last 4-5 years is the signing of the 4 foundational agreements. You're seeing a revitalized Malabar exercise with the 4 Quad countries being very active. You're seeing much greater arms sales, up to $20 billion now cumulatively. And the 2+2 dialogue we just concluded a couple of weeks back here in Washington is structured in a way that prioritizes foreign and defense ministers of both sides. There is no trade presence, there is no environmental presence, there is no other type of presence, although these are very important issues for both countries. Tell us something about this. I mean, in my mind, the balance of emphasis is skewed quite a lot in the direction of the mill to mill, whereas what one might want to do is rebalance it. And indeed, there are risks that are associated with an overtly military sort of a relationship. It's not an alliance, but increasingly feeling like one, an informal alliance, perhaps.
What I like to say is that it actually exhibits, the India-US relationship now exhibits many of the features of a formal alliance, short of a mutual commitment to defending each other. I'm short of that. Many of the features of a normal alliance are there in terms of consultation, in terms of interoperability, in terms of, and that's based on a growing congruence of interests, certainly in the Indo-Pacific, across the Indo-Pacific. But don't forget, these are 2 countries of very different levels of development, very different geographies. And so it's therefore it's congruence. It's not identity of interests or on everything. It's not. And especially when you get into the other areas, it takes much harder work to actually start looking at what we can do together, how we can match our interests, where the Venn diagram overlaps, of interest. When you come to issues like climate change, like energy and so on, there are huge areas and potentials. And for India, these are very important. I mean, the US has been a partner in our transformation. We wouldn't be feeding ourselves with the Green Revolution if it weren't for what we did with the US in the late 60s, early 70s. So there's a history to this. On the economic side, unfortunately, both sides have turned inwards in the last decade or so. In fact, a little less, maybe a little less than a decade. But the fact is, I mean, the US is not going back into TPP. India walked out of our CEP. And I think that sort of Build Back Better is primarily a domestic goal. The WTO is not, being stood up all over again or being used the way it was previously. Is not seen as being in the US interest quite the same way. The same thing in India. I mean, we've raised tariffs steadily for the last 4 years. So I think that's where maybe much more work needs to be done on the economic side, because as I keep saying, you can't walk on one leg. It's not going to work this way. You need a much more balanced relationship. So I agree with you entirely. I can see the reasons why we've ended up like this. And we've used the low-hanging fruit. We've moved forward where we can, where it's easy, natural. I mean, that's normal, that's human. But I do think you're right, that we do need to look at the bigger relationship and work on the rest of it.
Right. I'm going to pick up a question from our viewers, from Jan Weinberg, who talks about the militarization programs of the United States in Asia as a means to maintain hegemonic interests in the light of China's rise. And he says that it negatively affects broader Asian security. Now, I'm going to draw from that and actually talk a little bit about what you said in your book, India and Asian Geopolitics. You talked about China quite extensively, and your framing of China was a sort of a major power, major civilization that inherently looks at the world or the region through hierarchical eyes, that seeks to establish a hierarchical order, that it's dominant, it is superior, its neighbors are inferior, tributaries, and so forth. You even talk about the Zhang expedition. That was, you saying it was an imperial expedition. That was not a constructive mission. Now, there's no question that in recent years, China's behavior has not been particularly productive or positive. You've seen intrusions in South China Sea. You have seen intrusions on the Indian border. You have seen Gulf warrior diplomacy. There's no question that we are dealing with a more hardline, a more nationalist China in the region. But you also say in your book that the United States is a net security provider to Asia. And you, of course, in your book and your writings, include the Middle East in Asia. Indeed, it is a part of Asia if you look at how the continent is defined. But then, if I look at the United States' behavior in the region, in Asia, starting from the Cold War years, the Vietnam War, the Indonesian intervention that led to the deaths of so many people in the 60s, and then, of course, Iraq and the other Middle East interventions, it doesn't seem to me, while conceding many points on your China argument, it doesn't seem to me that the US has been a net security provider in many cases. It could be, sometimes it is, but in many cases it detracts from regional security. Indeed, the Middle East adventures have been horrific. We at the Quincy Institute have a lot of writing and events around that all viewers should take a look at if they haven't already. And this is not just a minor thing. These are major destabilizing sorts of interventions. So would you still stay with that sort of a framing of yours when it comes to the US and China?
Well, let me explain where I'm coming from. Asia's prosperity is based on international trade, exports, imports, on energy imports, and frankly, the phenomenal growth in China and India, in the various other countries who industrialized earlier, Korea and so on. This wouldn't have been possible without the maritime security that the US provided, without the safety of the sea lanes across the Indo-Pacific, which the US provided. So I think that was the basis on which is why and that is still the basis on which the globalized economy operates. It's when that is contested in the seas near China, for instance, that you then have trouble, when you now start seeing claims to territorializing the South China Sea, which has been an open highway for India. 38% of our foreign trade goes through those waters. That's quite a bit. So I think that is critical. And that has been critical, that security that the US provided, that the US has worked with allies and with others to provide, even on land. I mean, you'll take the example of Afghanistan, for instance. Frankly, Afghanistan's other neighbors got a free ride because the US was providing security in Afghanistan. Now that the US has pulled out, what's happening? Suddenly, Pakistan is bombing Afghanistan. The Taliban in Pakistan has mounted attacks across the board. I mean, terrorism has gone up tremendously. China is trying to come to some accommodation and trying to make some arrangements. Why is Russia talking to Pakistan? Because they're hoping that they might have some influence on the Taliban and prevent the spread of what could come out of. And this is true of all of them. I mean, whether it's Iran, whether it's Russia, whether it's China, So long as the US was providing a level of security, and now that that's gone, suddenly it's missed. So I think one needs to look at it in a much more complicated way than I think just a straightforward, the US hasn't solved every problem in the area. Yes, it's not in the US interest to get involved in solving everything. It's not running everybody's day-to-day life. And there's a whole host of issues which they're quite happy to leave to other people to do. I mean, Syria was a good example of that. But the US net, I think, has been a provider of security, and Asia has benefited from that. But today it's increasingly contested, and there are questions after the last US administration of US staying power. Because now that we hear voices in the US saying the US shouldn't be involved in these sorts of exercises abroad. So you get signs of countries saying, we'll take charge of our own security, but that leads to other security dilemmas between Japan and China, for instance. In many cases, that leads to actual local insecurity. Let's see. I think I would describe the present situation as one where we are in flux. But I think, China is a global economic power. There's no superpower. There's no question. I mean, she affects global markets. She has economic reach. But she's still politically and militarily a local power with limits to her power. When there was trouble in Kazakhstan, big neighbor, important to China for BRI, various reasons, ethnicity, etc. Who intervened? Who sent in troops and stabilized the regime? Russia. Where was China? I mean, what happens in Ukraine, for instance, is another instance of the limits of power. I mean, there is only one global superpower in military terms today. Others might be challenging that regionally in their own little regions. But only the US has the capability to project military force across the globe wherever she wants, whenever she wants. Nobody else does. So you have an economically multipolar world, a world which is militarily still unipolar, but tending towards regionalization, as it were, fragmentation. Because, I mean, the Chinese can mount a real challenge in the seas near China, for instance, but politically thoroughly confused because there's no global order functioning. We saw the response to the pandemic. We saw the response to Ukraine. I mean, there's no real global order taking care of the big issues that face us. So politically thoroughly confused. So we are between orders, to my mind. And so we get security where we can get it. We look for help. And I mean, my own solution is, be practical in this situation. There's no one size fits all. And that's what really worries me about this framing of, autocracy, free world. It assumes there's a functioning free world and there's a functioning autocratic world, which there isn't. There's no common term. There's no.
Right. No, somewhere in your writings, you seem to favor this one of the lenses of international relations, which is hegemonic stability, where you have and correct me if I'm wrong, that you have a superpower that secures sea lanes, that provides public goods. And under the aegis of that superpower, middle powers, smaller powers indeed can flourish. A very 1990s type of possibility that many people thought was going to happen. But of course, that is not in the consonance with the idea of a multipolar world. That is not in consonance with the idea of what we see. No doubt the sea lanes are protected, but the sea lanes also see phone ops and other activities, as they indeed do activities by other major powers, including China. So it's a bit contested. And also, is it necessary? Because we've had in pre-modern times, certainly, we've had in orders where multiple, in Asia, where multiple powers, there was no hegemony. You yourself have written about this, the Indian, Southeast Asian, Chinese and other systems that coexisted without there being an attempt to become a hegemon. Jungha's one expedition was the only one from China. India didn't really have any of that, and nor did Southeast Asia. So why should what worked in the past not work for the future?
I agree with you 100%, actually. I'm not pushing for a hegemonic. Objectively, maybe India did best. The high growth years were the unipolar years of the global order. I mean, after the end of the Cold War, those are the best years for India, but best years for China as well, in some ways, economically speaking. But that's not what I think. I don't think we're going there, because I don't think the US wishes to play that role anymore. I'm not sure that US domestic politics will support it. I don't think China can play that role or will be ready to play it for a very long time. And I don't know why we assume that there must be a global order, because for most of history, there hasn't been a global order. This is an aberration, this idea that there's one world, and even post-war, there wasn't one order, there were two orders. It was a bipolar system that we were in the Cold War. For most of history, actually, we lived in sort of multiverses. Each one there was, an Indian Ocean world, there was an East Asian world, the Southeast Asian world. They dealt with each other. They exchanged goods, ideas, people, religion, language, whatever, science, technology. But they weren't part of each other's political and security calculus. And that was the basis of coexistence. They didn't get into each other's. Today, I think that is less. Now that we have all decided to be Westphalian states, we seem to have absorbed, the philosophies that go with it, about contention, about the scramble for power, I don't see that that's inevitable. I think ultimately our own self-interest will lead us to another version of multiverses, and that's what we are. If you look around the world today, what's happening? The world economy is fragmenting into very large regional blocks. The EU, NAFTA, or whatever, USMCA, RCEP, CPTPP, which now China has applied to. The economy is fragmenting. Politics has become very local in terms of identity. The new authoritarians basically rely on a form of ultranationalism, almost xenophobia. And politics has become the politics of emotion, of mob psychology almost, across the world. I mean, this is not aided by technology. So in a sense, we seem to be heading in that direction, back to reverting to a historical norm which doesn't fit into neat, easy categories, but worked for most of history. So I mean, if you pushed me, that's where I would say today that I think it's going. And I think what you're seeing, what Ukraine has done is you're going to have a Europe which is going to be consumed with its own issues, with its own order, for a very long time now. Yes, they'll be a global power, but they won't be a major player in the Indo-Pacific. Haven't been for some time. So the same thing, I mean, each of us is drawing inwards and concentrating more on our own immediate neighborhoods. China's in a very crowded neighborhood. Her economy is reverting to mean. I mean, I make the arguments in the book about where I think she's going. So if I had to guess, that's where I think we're going.
Sure. The one thing I would respond there is that although you may be right, we may be fragmenting, there are deep interconnections globally in terms of what Kofi Annan called problems without passports. Climate change being one, but not the only one. And there is we perhaps may not be able to afford too much fragmentation. But then apart, let me get a little bit now to some possibilities on US, China. You have observed both countries, your ambassador to China. There are serious issues between the United States and China. Many of them are historical. They have escalated. South Asia is, of course, a participant in some process. Where do you see possibilities? We all know the disputes, but where do you see the possibilities of US, China cooperation, if any? And what role can South Asia play in this process? And by that I mean India, but also its neighboring countries.
Well, the trouble is, I think that for the smaller South Asian countries, Nepal, for instance, has become a place where both China and the US are competing for influence. I mean, whether it was a Millennium Challenge Corporation or whether it's getting Nepal to be part of the Belt and Road and tying her into the Chinese economy. Now, up to a certain extent, countries like Sri Lanka, Nepal, Bangladesh can use this for their own development, to get infrastructure built, to get ports developed, roads, etc., bridges, as they did during the Cold War between the two blocs. But the trouble is that it's now geopolitical and much more acute Sino-US relations. And when it becomes choose a side, then it becomes much more difficult. It hasn't got to that stage for South Asia yet. But if South Asia had a choice, and this is true of India, of the others, I think we would like some level of accommodation between China and the US, which enables us to concentrate on the important things, on our own growth, on our own transformation. But it's very hard to predict, because if you look at the course of internal Chinese politics, and what seems to be, well, the iron seems to have entered the soul, the idea that somehow the US is inveterately hostile to China and will prevent China's resuming her rightful place in the world. That seems to have sort of seeped into, not just the official Chinese line and so on, but even into popular consciousness. That makes me much more worried about where that relationship is going. I really don't know. And I don't think domestic politics in either country, China or the US, is today in a condition to support the kinds of effort that would be needed to restore some balance, some sanity in the relationship. It doesn't seem likely, certainly not in a year when there's a party Congress coming with big decisions. And then once you get into the US election cycle, I think that's another issue. So I'm at a bit of a loss to say where I think this might go at this moment. What can India do about it? Not much, except to talk sense to both sides and say, let's do the important things. But we have our own issues with China, and serious issues. China is the only great power who seems to object and actually oppose India's rise. I mean, in various ways, whether it's membership of the NSG and so on. China is now willing to be seen to be, rather than just organizing opposition from behind the screen. So I think there is, and of course, you've seen what's happened on the border. So in 2020 and since, we still have about 120,000 troops from both sides lined up on that border in very inhospitable climates. So it seems to me that we have a really difficult task ahead in terms of managing all these relationships, and the triangular, certainly. It's not easy at all.
We are running out of time, but I'm going to try and sneak in one more question. And this is tied to an audience question from Manuel Fiadero. I'm hopefully pronouncing the name right. And he talks about India in BRICS. But I want to expand that to actually think of India in multilateral organizations that are outside, perhaps across Asia or even beyond. One of them is a very important trade pact called the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, which is the largest trade pact in the world, which is ASEAN-led, by the way. There's a lot of impressions in some quarters it's a Chinese-led process. It's an ASEAN-led process. India negotiated, was a co-part of the negotiations. At the last minute, India walked away from it. In the United States, there is a tremendous aversion and allergy to joining trade pacts. It's politically a dead thing in the water. India seems to be in the same boat as the US on trade, Unlike East and Southeast Asia, including countries like Vietnam, which are not very prosperous, who are putting their front foot forward, they are very confident about joining trade agreements, although they, of course, have reservations and they do carve out. But nevertheless, they want to be in the room and in the game. What is South Asia's lack of internal integration, South Asia's non-participation in these trade agreements, a phobia towards trade that seems to have set in, although we have seen India negotiating recently with Australia and the EU. So I should make that point here. But nevertheless, it is not exactly a pro-trade type of a policy at this time in the US or in India. What does this mean for the Asian order?
Well, I don't think it's an aversion to trade pacts as such. I think it's a feeling that the RCEP amounts to opening the Indian market to China, and that this would have very bad effects on Indian industry and on the Indian economy, that it would actually, we already have a trade deficit, which is huge. I mean, China's our number one trading partner, but we have an $80 billion trade deficit with China, which is enormous. And I think that was really the determining consideration. There were others about what we wanted in the negotiations, but this, I think, was the key. Because since then, I mean, India has been negotiating, has restarted negotiations with the EU, with Britain, has concluded something with the UAE, a trade pact, and with Australia, an early harvest, which we then will develop on. And so it's not as though I think we are unwilling to enter, and I think we understand the importance. You know, almost half of our GDP today is the external sector. If you add merchandise trade, plus remittances, plus other capital flows and so on, we are now actually almost just a little bit less than half. So it's very important. And just merchandise trade crossed $1 trillion in the last fiscal year, 21-22. So it's not as though India is about to cut herself off from the world and walk away. But I think the terms need to be not just negotiated, but also understood internally and negotiated internally among ourselves. And I think maybe that's what was not done in the RCEP case. So let's see. I mean, we are still working with ASEAN, with other members of the RCEP to see what we can do. But we do have our work cut out for us. I'm on record saying that I think I'm not sure that was the right thing to do. You know, I remember being taught very early in our diplomatic career that it's very easy to walk out. It's much harder to walk back in. And I think maybe we've worked ourselves into that position because of what we were saying earlier. You can't have a great political defense security relationship without an economic leg to stand on. And as our CP becomes more formalized, more integrated within itself, it's going to be harder for countries outside the bloc, like India, like the US, to actually be effective actors in that geography, effective economic actors in that geography.
Right. Indeed, in the United States, we are soon going to see an ASEAN Summit of Leaders in Washington. And there is going to be, there is a plan in the works on the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, which we are all awaiting. And we have to see how the United States responds to this economic dynamism in Asia, East and Southeast Asia particularly, and how it chooses to go forward if trade agreements are not an option. But we have unfortunately run out of time and in fact exceeded our time. I have so many more things to ask you, but perhaps this will have to wait for another event with us at Quincy Institute. But I want to thank you so much for coming here and sharing your thoughts on South Asia, Asia, and indeed the global.
But I must thank you, Sarang. I really enjoyed that conversation, and we, I think, covered a fair amount of ground.
Yes.
Thank you for that. Thank you. And thank you for reading my book so carefully. That's a bit worrying.
It's not hard to do that, I can tell you that. It was a very engrossing book. I want to also tell viewers that we have an event on May 9th where our Director of East Asian Program, Michael Swain, will be in conversation with former Australian Prime Minister Kevin Rudd on his recent book on China. So if you're interested in Asia or indeed the world and what we do here at the Quincy Institute, please do tune in and register for next week's event. Thank you very much to all.
Thank you. Thank you very much.